Hello, and welcome everyone to our final Lunch and Learn webinar of 2025. Your rights as a person with a disability under the ADA in personal emergency preparedness. I am Jan Garrett, Deputy Director of the Pacific ADA Center, and we are very pleased to have today with us Heather Lafferty from Nevada, who the Department of Emergency Management, who will talk to us about the issues about ADA and emergency preparedness in Nevada that she deals with on a day-to-day basis. So we will be taking questions at the end, but only through the chat. So please place your questions into the chat as they come to your mind, and then we will address them in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. So there is Heather, Chief Resilience Officer, State Hazard Mitigation Officer as well for the Nevada Office of Emergency Management. And about the Pacific ADA Center, we are one of 10 national ADA network centers, and we exist to provide resources, training, and support, improve awareness and understanding of the rights and responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. So this is showing a map of the ADA National Network centers, and we are Region 9, the state's in green for those of you who can see the map, and there are 10 total regions. So we are pleased to have Nevada in our region where Heather is. So I'm going to now turn it over to Heather to do her presentation. Thank you so much and welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Jan, and I deeply appreciate it. Before we get too deep into it and I get into introductions, I did just want to say the Pacific ADA is not only a friend to Nevada and the Office of Emergency Management in what we call blue skies operations or normal operations, but we also rely heavily on their expertise when we are activated and actively in disaster to navigate the ADA space and make sure we're being accessible for all Nevadans. So I deeply appreciate being invited to speak with everyone today. On screen, you're going to see the Nevada desert on fire because wildfires are one of our bigger issues that we deal with here in Nevada for disasters. And again, before we get too deep in introductions, I did want to take a minute to talk about resilience because when we use the word resilience in the disability community, we often are talking about the resilience we have when we navigate our circumstances, our disability, when we're navigating the political environment, and when we're navigating our physical environment. And so resilience kind of has a special and unique meaning, when you're in the disability community. And I want to give you the definition and kind of the thought behind how we use resilience in emergency management. So in emergency management, when we are talking about resilience, we are talking about resilience equals individual communities, systems, and organizations, and their ability to withstand, adapt, and recover from shocks and stresses. And so that's the all-encompassing mission, really, when you boil it down at its core of what we're doing in emergency management, helping our communities withstand, adapt, and recover from any shock and stressor that might be impacting it. And so I just wanted to highlight that before we dive too deep into our presentation today. Thank you. Next slide. And so I will just briefly introduce myself. Again, as Jan mentioned, I am Heather Lafferty. I am the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of Nevada and the Office of Emergency Management. I'm also the founder of the Nevada Access and Functional Needs Disaster Coalition and our State Hazard Mitigation Officer. And so it's great to get to be here and speak with everyone today on this Lunch and Learn as we dive into a little bit about emergency management, get an understanding of the situations and landscape of emergency management and how we really navigate that with our rights under the ADA. Thank you. Next slide. And so on screen, if you can, will see a woman sitting in a wheelchair at a shelter. And I put one of my favorite quotes in this presentation, which is, "There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about." And my job in emergency management is to make sure that our emergency managers, our systems that we develop, our response efforts, the plans that we make, care about everyone. And that includes people with disabilities and access and functional needs. And so I always like to put this quote in here because, like kind of in our world, we say, "Show me where your budget is and I'll show you what you care about." And that's kind of my approach to emergency management as well. Thank you. Next slide. And so as we talk today, and Jan, you can kind of just bebop through this list here. We are going to be talking about older adults and disasters, and also individuals with disabilities and the ADA and everyone with an access and functional needs. And so we're going to be kind of diving into the mission, so you have a deeper understanding of the mission in Nevada when it comes to emergency management, kind of the landscape of emergency management, what keeps us up at night, and then really getting into access and functional needs, that CMIS framework, which we'll define out, and also meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities, access and functional needs, and older adults. Thank you, Jan. Next slide. And so our purpose, and I'm only going to briefly touch on this, the purpose at the Nevada Office of Emergency Management for all staff, for our whole team, is helping people before, during, and after a disaster. And our mission is really helping Nevada prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies and disasters by building a more resilient Nevada through partnerships and collaborations. And so I just highlighted that real quick so you have a understanding of where we're coming from in the Office of Emergency Management. Thank you. Next slide. And so when we talk about emergency management in the disaster landscape and kind of what keeps us up at night, you have those historical hazards, right? And disasters and shocks and stressors that we're all pretty used to, right? Especially on the West Coast and Region 9, the Pacific ADA, right? Our region. We're all pretty used to wildfires, earthquakes, flooding, right? We have pretty severe winter storms, cybersecurity. I don't know, if you've been following the news, but Nevada was cyber attacked not very long ago, and we're still in recovery from that cyber incident. They attacked the entire state system. And of course, all of us, have, active shooters, and we all made it somewhat through the pandemic. And so, these are the emergencies that we're historically used to dealing with. But one of the things we are noticing at the Office of Emergency Management in Nevada is there is an increased number of these disaster events, wildfires, atmospheric rivers, and the variance and level and severity of these incidents and hazards are increasing in scope. And what that means is it's impacting our ability to get our lifelines back on track and back serving the community in a quick and efficient manner. And so what you'll see is, we're seeing stronger storms happening more regularly. And that's impacting, right, our ability to get power back online and water systems back up and working, roads cleared. And so these are some of the big challenges out there in the landscape right now for emergency management that I kind of just wanted to share with you so we all have the same understanding of what the landscape is before we kind of get into some of the specifics. Thank you. Next slide. And so, on top of that, some of the stuff around just the increasing severity um, and occurrence of some of these hazards, we're also really looking at, right, critical infrastructure loss for power, fuel, communications, logistics, how do we get, fuel from California if California is impacted to Nevada, which almost exclusively relies on Nevada, on California fuel, right? And then water systems, especially in Nevada's rural and frontier communities, right? And then we're all very concerned and, looking at, of course, what's going on between nations and the national landscape and what happens if a resource we normally depend on, like the Nevada National Guard, is not available because they might be deployed out of country. And so, how do we make sure our communities and our individuals who aren't able to evacuate, especially in our rural, tribal, and frontier areas, still get that support and resources from the state level during some of these disasters? And how do we make sure we're maintaining um, all of the things that need to be maintained throughout the disaster and really achieving what we want to do with limited or some resources not available. Thank you. Next slide. And so now that we have kind of an understanding of the landscape that we're currently operating in, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the ADA and how that kind of interacts with emergency management and some of these, disaster and increasing challenges that we're facing. But first, I want to make sure we all have the same kind of definition and understanding of terms in the way that I'm using them or that we're using them in emergency management. And so when we're talking about access and functional needs, that is really anyone, right, who needs access to resources before, during, or after an emergency to function. And that, of course, includes individuals with disabilities, minor children, people without transportation, or maybe without a smartphone. Older adults, people taking medication, or with limited English as their primary language. And so this is kind of a broad, all-encompassing tool that we're using. And one of the ways in emergency management, we came up with the framework. Yes, next slide. Thank you, Jan. We came up with a framework called the CMIS framework. Any of you who were with us when we spoke before, when I got to come speak with the ADA, we dove pretty deep into CMIS. But for some of our newer friends, CMIS is a framework on how we work with emergency managers to really approach making emergency management accessible and meeting not just the requirements of the ADA, but the spirit of the ADA before, during, and throughout the entire enterprise and cycle of a disaster. And so the way I want you to really think about CMIST is, what does everyone in a disaster need? Everyone in a disaster needs the ability to communicate. Everyone in a disaster needs the ability to maintain their health and whatever that looks like for you. Everyone in a disaster needs the ability to maintain their independence. Everyone in a disaster still needs the ability to get the supportive care and assistance that they need to be safe and also to self-determine um, what courses of actions throughout this disaster they want to take. And then, of course, everyone needs the ability um, for transportation and evacuation. And even after that initial evacuation, the ability to reconnect and get systems back online so that we can make it to our dialysis appointments, or we can make it, to and from the places we need to go to get reconnected with our community and our services. And so that's really at its base level what the CMIS framework is. Just looking at those things that everyone needs to thrive and survive during a disaster to have access to in order to function. Thank you. Next slide. And this is another concept I wanted to really kind of take us through, but before we get a little deeper, just so we have shared understanding. The teacher acronym, especially when I'm dealing and trying to engage with our local emergency managers, and I'm talking to them about how do we outreach and include our disability community in our planning, training, and exercising. And one of the exercises we really talk about and go through with the emergency managers is, before you ever really engage with the community, and then again, as you start that engagement with the community, you need to understand some fundamentals, which is, especially if we're talking about the disability community, trust, right? The historic lack of trust and relationship, right, that has existed between the disability community and government on multiple levels, from local, state, to national, right? Um, the economic factors impacting that community. So if I'm saying, or the emergency manager is saying, you need to be 30 days ready, and that comes with a lot of purchasing supplies and things like that. You need to understand, how disability and economics really can interact, and what kind of influence that has, what kind of chronic influence that has on our community. And then, isolation, and that's whether it's cultural isolation, or in Nevada, a lot of that isolation is actual from geography, because it's very rural and frontier. And so people are physically isolated from each other. And then, of course, what kind of capacity does the community have itself before the disaster ever even starts, um, to prepare and to engage, to even engage in these conversations. And then, of course, housing, and what type of housing is there? In Nevada, we have a accessible housing challenge before a disaster even happens, right? We have a housing challenge overall, but it's very, very, significant if we're looking for accessible housing. And so, that's a chronic influence that exists before you ever start to plan for the disaster, that you have to kind of understand and know about and work with the community on. And then, of course, right, racism, or those historical or current conditions, that can prevent a community from receiving resources. Because at its base, emergency management is about making sure communities have the resources they need to thrive and survive in a disaster. And so I did just want to show you how we even begin to approach engaging with communities in Nevada before we ever even get there. Thank you. Next slide. And then we are going to dig into, that was us digging into disaster situational awareness. And we're going to really, really dive in a little bit deeper in these next coming slides. Thank you. Next slide. And so when we talk about all hands prepared, that is, we have all hands meetings in emergency management. And one of the things I really try to engage in at the state level with the Office of Emergency Management, our emergency support functions, and other state agencies who help support operations in a disaster, and with our local emergency managers, is the how-tos of the must-dos, right? And the must-do is the ADA because, something we really need to be cognizant of or aware of is in a large scale disaster, the governor has the ability to waive all kinds of different rules and regulations. So we can waive the rule on how long truckers can truck supplies. We can waive all types of healthcare rules on requirements around Medicaid but what we can't ever waive is the ADA. So the ADA applies whether you are in or out of a disaster. And one of the things it clearly states is that all emergency management programs, services, activities, the facilities that we use, so our shelters, our disaster resource centers, are points of distribution where you're going to get maybe vaccines or water or food in a disaster, right? All of these must be, not should be, but must be accessible to people with disabilities. And this includes our emergency programs. So how we plan for, exercise, and then execute in a disaster, right? And so I just want to make very clear, right, that this applies to all programs and services and activities provided by the state and local governments, as well as those by third parties, because in a disaster, quite frequently, we are using nonprofits, we are using non-government support, right, to get those resources so people can function in a disaster. Next slide. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight is, and we actually got this number from a study the Pacific ADA did on behalf of our region, which is, it is very, very important we have a person-centered approach to disasters. In the wake of a disaster, there is a greater risk for people with disabilities, 5 to 10 times higher than for non-disabled people to experience. And, this includes lack of access to food and water, right? Lack of electricity for medical devices, isolation, unsanitary conditions, right? Fear of crime, exposure to financial scams. And so using the ADA, right, as that bedrock, and all of the compliance that comes with it in 508 and Title II, and we really try to develop a person-centered approach to make sure that we're planning for and with, or sorry, planning with rather, Nevada's disability community, and they are engaged in every step of the way so that we can start to reduce some of these risk factors that we see in these studies that happen repetitively, right? And so this is kind of the primary focus of the Access and Functional Needs Officer at the state level when they're engaging with the disability community. Next slide. So kind of another one of the big highlights of the how-tos of the must-dos that we go over in All Hands Prepared when we're doing our All Hands Teams meetings, that we really try to make sure all sections understand is, we've really tried to eradicate from our planning at the state level is the use of vulnerable populations. Because when you really think about it, what communities and individuals, what are they saying when they mean vulnerable, right? If we plan and respond and recover with our disability populations, and we have already met the accessibility and functional needs that they're going to need to thrive and survive in a disaster, then are they really vulnerable, right? Um, and so if we see the biggest impact of these communities in a disaster continuously, from disaster to disaster, then my opinion is the primary focus of disaster preparedness and response should be on meeting the access and functional needs of those most at risk. Because if 90% of the community is able to get into their car and evacuate, what we really need to be focused on is those who cannot, right? And working with them to collaborate, make sure our plans are strong, and we can meet the access and functional needs throughout the disaster cycle. Thank you. Next slide. And so when you're taking an all hands prepared, person-centered, accessible approach to disaster, some of that looks like what we're focused on for ADA improvement is training on ADA requirements with all staff, and also, with our local emergency managers and our third-party partners, our emergency support functions, making sure that they understand, right, the basics of the ADA requirements and that it is not waivable in a disaster, and some of the bigger gaps that we still continually see. Making sure we're doing community outreach using that teacher acronym and having a deeper understanding of the community you're engaging with, particularly when we're doing outreach to individuals with disabilities. When we do our exercises, it's absolutely vital that when we're testing our plans and our exercises, that we are doing that with the disability community, and not just having someone pretend, so that we can actually test our systems together and our community together to see if we're really, really getting this right or not. So we're failing together in the exercise and not in the middle of the disaster. And then, of course, making sure our communications are accessible when we're putting out emergency alerts, and when we're putting out guidance. And so, these are some of the big things that we're focused on. And our partners and disability partners in Nevada help us every step of the way, along with the ADA Pacific, as subject matter experts, so that we're doing this together. Some of the big ones we're also focused on, of course, is backup power and accessible transportation. The accessible transportation piece in Las Vegas, or really anywhere in Nevada, is the challenge. That's one of those chronic influences that exist before a disaster ever happens. And so, understanding that and planning with the community on how do we overcome this when we have this challenge before something ever even occurs is absolutely vital to life safety, because everyone has the absolute right to accessible transportation and evacuation. Thank you. Next slide. This is on the screen, I have put the 14 points of inequity in the disaster cycle, because I believe transparency is very, very important. And before FEMA made some changes in the Office of Disability this year, they had put out, the Office of Disability at FEMA had put out their 14 points of inequity that they see continually in disaster after disaster. And I just wanted to highlight those to show, for transparent regions, how we are failing to comply with the ADA nationally in some of these disasters, and what all of us should be collaborating on and really focusing on to reduce the risks to individuals with disabilities and disasters. And it starts with inclusive planning, alerts and warning, information access. So not just is the information accessible, but is it culturally informed? Evacuation, transportation, of course, that emergency contact and search and rescue, sheltering, our communication aids and assistive services, ASL interpreters. Are they using them, right? A lot of times they are not. Are the documents formatted or the emergency alerts formatted for screen readers? Is everything 508 compliant for web-based content? If we're using the internet for emergency awareness and evacuation, and we're putting out zones and stuff like that. So we're still seeing big gaps there. Recovery mitigation, and our medical care and health, right? And so the last couple of the 14 points of inequity are power dependency, right? So, when we talk about power dependency, we're really talking about those who need power to function and maintain their health in a disaster. So maybe you're on dialysis or you have oxygen concentrator, these type of things, and getting connected with our personal care services. And we still see big gaps in people allowing service animals, which we know has already been defined for us. And so, special diets, drinking water, registering for disaster services, the recovery piece after the disasters happened. A lot of our disaster services in recovery are not accessible again, and most of that comes back to the ADA and communication, and not just using those best practices. Housing, and then of course pre-disaster homework, school life. So it is much harder for individuals with disabilities to return to that pre-disaster home, school, work, or community life post-disaster than their non-disabled counterparts. And so this was the picture FEMA gave us before significant federal changes were made this year. But this is still one of my priorities and a list that I'm using in partnership with the disability community here in Nevada to close some of these points of inequity. So I did just want to share that for transparency. Thank you. Next slide. And then again, this is just highlighting because I feel like, sometimes we have made great progress. We have access and functional needs officers working in many states now, but we are still in disaster after disaster seeing significant impacts, disproportionately impact people with disabilities, which is, a 30 to 50% increase in disaster-related fatality among people with disabilities. And so, a lot of that comes from interrupted care. And that big piece of interrupted care, if you're planning with the disability community itself, a lot of this can be navigated and planned for in advance. And so that's why it's so important, again, nothing about us without us, that we're planning with our partners in the disability community and not for them. Thank you. Next slide. I just wanted to give you a small background on the screen. There's a breakdown in numbers, which I'll read in a second here, of the overview of Nevada, just in case some of you haven't got to visit Nevada or aren't familiar with Nevada. We have 17 counties, 15 of those counties being designated as rural or frontier. And we have about 700,000 adults in Nevada with a disability. And then according to the CDC's last estimate, that's about 28% of Nevadans with a disability. And so I just wanted to highlight that so you have a deeper understanding of kind of the background in Nevada. I will say, when it comes to data and numbers, especially in Nevada, we are a very transient state. We have Las Vegas, we have Reno. And so these numbers kind of change quite frequently. But I did want to give you just a better understanding, a little bit of Nevada, if you haven't been here before. Okay, next slide. And then, one of the things I want to talk about now is, how we advocate for ourselves in a disaster and how we partner to do this together. So when we're coordinating our way through what I like to call a Big Daddy disaster, this is a disaster impacting multiple counties, right, with multiple lifelines, like power or water impacted. It's very, very important that we're coordinating these together. And so there's a couple of different ways that we do that. And I would just like to go through some of those with you and really talk about how we navigate this together. But first, in case you haven't been in a Big Daddy disaster, if we go to the next slide, I want to just kind of talk you through real quick what that impact looks like. And I want you to think about yourself and your own needs, the things that you need access to function. When I was deployed to Hurricane Helene to support North Carolina, I arrived around October 11th. And I just want to take you through what it looked like. We're almost 2 weeks into this disaster, right? After the hurricane hit. And I want you to see what conditions on the ground were like. So 2 weeks in, we still have multiple counties on boil water notices. We have 16 shelter opens with about 622 occupants and 86 pets. We're serving about 300,000 meals. We have power outages still. And I want you to think about that power outage, which on screen is highlighted in a red color for that lifeline, because they have been without power for 2 weeks. And imagine, you and your needs and what that looks like for your family, if you have been without power in your community for 2 weeks and what type of cascading impacts that might have. We still had 645 roads closed. Some of those major interstates are closed. And then, we still had actual life-threatening situations with ongoing landslides, and flooding. And so, this I just want to give you, because the scope of these things can be very big. And that's why the solutions for these things have to be intentional and they have to be coordinated together because accessibility and capability and resources are going to change minute by minute. And these are challenges that we have to have systems in place to deal with in real time over a long time. Especially if it's a Big Daddy disaster. Next slide. Thank you. And so we're going to dive in to meeting the ADA during disaster and what that looks like operationally. How are we doing this operationally to make sure we're meeting some of these requirements of the ADA? Next slide. And so one of the ways we do that is through bridging knowledge. When we're first engaging with the community, we make sure that we are focusing on the entire, what we call the culture wheel of that community, really getting to understand the greater community, their knowledge and stories, their language, traditions and rituals, technologies and skills, and capabilities, what type of tools and objects are common in that community and frequently used, right? And so in our community, right, we quite often use screen readers. And that's an example of a tool we might use, or interpreters, right? That's a type of tool we use to communicate. And then, of course, what's important to that community for the arts, for food and drinks, and then what do they value? And so these are some of the things we have to understand about each other to successfully navigate something as big and traumatic as a, Big Daddy disaster. Thank you. Next slide. And so one of the key ways you're going to see accessibility in the ADA really operationally deployed, and solving some of these challenges that arrive in our sheltering, in our transportation, throughout the disaster is what we call disability stakeholder calls. And so in our operational period, we will set up a disability stakeholder call, and this will be open to our disability law centers, to the Pacific ADA, to disability partners, nonprofits, the Red Cross. It'll have the emergency operations teams, actual response, chiefs. FEMA will be in there. And all of us will be in these, aging and disability will be in these coordination calls. And all of us will be in there together, and we'll be talking about what rumors are you hearing from your community? What verified challenges? What resources is your community missing? Are you hearing about anyone isolated, or that we need search and rescue out checking on? And these are all the types of things that we're really coordinating together in the middle of operations. Because one of the most important things is, again, that we're not admiring problems as they happen, but we're solving problems. And we're getting the subject matter experts, the most capable of solving problems, engaged and in it throughout the disaster. Okay, next slide. And so, one of the challenges we did have in Hurricane Helene, right, is we had power out, and this started to really, really impact some of our communities with disabilities. And this is an example of something that we used that coordination call to form an independent living task force with our disability partners to identify and prioritize who are we outreaching first, who are we sending search and rescue teams to, and making sure that we were doing that together to close down some of these gaps. Next slide. And we'll actually skip this one, the next one, and the next one, because we're running out just a little bit of time. And next slide. And so I wanted to kind of spend our last minutes before we go to questions, wrapping up on person-centered preparedness and how we can use person-centered preparedness when we talk about this with ourselves as we prepare, and with emergency managers, to make sure, again, we're not just meeting the actual mandated intent of the ADA, but the spirit of the ADA. And we're actually helping our communities get access to the resources they need to maintain their health and independence during a disaster. And we do this by what I like to call our person-centered preparedness wheel, right? Thinking through and planning with our subject matter experts on assistive technology, and making sure all of our systems can engage with this assistive technology, or that individuals, when they're being evacuated, are evacuated with their assistive technology, right? Working with our healthcare coalitions and our disability partners on the management of health and disasters and what that looks like specifically for disability communities. And personal support. How do we reconnect, or even from the start, first do no harm, and don't separate people from their personal care attendant in a disaster, right? Or in a shelter situation. Communication, accessibility, making sure we have really good plans for our assisted animals and really making sure everyone understands the laws and guidance around assistant animals. And then, what type of living situation, because, oftentimes you're going to find in the disability community, our living situation might look significantly different than what people, most people would consider a normal, living situation. And so are we planning or even have an understanding of that when we're making our plans, right? And then, of course, that social connectedness. And I will say, I think social connectedness is the biggest piece of this. Um, One thing we have seen in disaster after disaster after disaster is individuals with disabilities who have social connectedness and who are partnering with their emergency management and their communities. Social connectedness is how we get no fatalities in evacuation, how we get support during prolonged disasters. And so that's very, very vital to our planning. And then, of course, last, transportation. And again, understanding those chronic influences on a community. If I'm rural frontier, before the disaster even happens, I might not even have some version of accessible transportation. And so at the state, if I understand that, and I've worked with that community, I know that part of the state's job is going to have to be to support that community with accessible transportation, and that can already be in my plans. Um, and so I know this was kind of a quick overview of the emergency management landscape and talking through how this kind of interacts with the ADA. But hopefully that made some sense and gave you a better understanding of where we are currently in Nevada and how we're engaging our partners and how I hope you will engage with your communities and your partners. Um, and so that I will kind of end there. Um, and I will be open, Jan, for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure we let's cover some of those questions. There's several slides. Sorry, I'm um, moving through the slides. But yeah, please do take a moment to fill out the evaluation as we've put in the chat. But here is Heather's contact information, and then we have our contact information at the ADA Center on the last slide. But I will leave Heather's up for the moment, and then we will read out some of the questions. There's been several questions and comments throughout the webinar. So let me go down here and get the first question. Let's see. So there's lots of people requesting the slides, and those will ultimately go out. And then if you need some specific help, please contact your ADA National Network Center wherever you are in the country at 1-800-949-4232. If you have a specific question that relates to your situation, that's the best way to get answers. And then we're going to look at some of these other questions. So there are some comments about Section 504 and Section 508, and then Title 6, Chapter 1, Part 15. Heather, I don't know if you can address those laws.
What? Sorry, Jan, I'm trying to see if I could see the actual question.
Okay, so please don't forget about Section 504 and 508 as
Okay.
well. Also, there is a CFR Title 6, Chapter 1, Part 15. I do know about 504 and 508, as I'm sure you do. I'm not exactly sure if I understand the 6 CFR Chapter 1, Part 15.
I also address after, when they're talking about the Stafford Act here, which includes people with disabilities and the
Yes.
post-Katrina amendment, that is absolutely correct. I will add to that a lot of what we're doing now is we are trying to make the rules in the ADA, the Stafford Act, 504, 508, we're trying to make that operational. And so a lot of our focus is how do we partner with the disability community. When you consider those chronic influences that exist before disaster happens, because much of our life is during blue skies is inaccessible to start with, right? And so that's really that's a great question. So yes, I am aware of all of those, and how we operationalize that is really that's my whole job. That's that's how why we're having this conversation today, because that's the part where we keep seeing gaps. And that's what we're kind of all pushing towards together. So that's a great question.
Yeah, and 504 is basically the precursor. It's the Rehabilitation Act precursor to the ADA, especially
Mhm.
Title II. And then 508 has to do with, your technology and being able to have information about that. And then, um, let's see. In your testing and exercising, are you finding broad AFN, access and functional needs, disability community participation, or a select few who are participating in those exercises? And do you think the broader public representation is needed?
So I definitely think broader public representation is needed, probably, if we're going to be frank, across nationally, not just in Nevada, but everywhere. I think we all emergency management could focus on this. I know FEMA before, some of the federal changes this year was focusing on how they had put out a guide specifically for emergency managers on how to make exercises, um, how to engage the community to partner, and make some of these test our plans in a better way. Um, in Nevada, we use multiple layers of, we have kind of a mix. We use some advocates you're probably pretty familiar with, like the Nevada's Governor's Office of, Developmental Disabilities, our Centers for Independent Living, um, or, even like the Pacific ADA, if it's a large scale exercise. But we also use community members as well. It's kind of a mix in Nevada. I don't think it's that way everywhere though. So that is still a gap. I do want to just highlight that.
And Rebecca asked him, she said that she finds the ADA design standards checklist for existing facilities incredibly helpful. Is there something available for emergency shelters? And I know the Pacific ADA has a pretty extensive form that can be used by government agencies for assessing emergency shelters. And you can contact us about that. It is something that would remain as an online form, but that could also be printed if necessary. So let us know about that. And then talking about someone talked about Gary talked about language access and the fact that some people who have disabilities also are limited in their English. They have limited English
Mhm.
proficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nevada has about six or seven main we call alternate language users, and we try very hard to put our emergency preparedness and messaging in all of those languages. Um, I will say I continually find in disaster after disaster um, that you're going to see the first big gap is almost always going to be interpreters. Um, a lot of emergency managers, I feel like, have gotten very good about translating into Spanish, or at least whatever their secondary most popular language is. But we still have significant gaps in engaging interpreters to make sure our deaf community is getting accessible emergency communications, especially at press conferences and ongoing disasters. So that still continues to be a big challenge.
Yeah, and I know some people have raised their hands. If you could, sorry about that. We won't really be unmuting people today, but if you could put your question in the chat. And so there's one person who asked about Nevada civil defense and what they are doing with regard to people with disabilities and access and functional needs.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Nevada, civil defense has really morphed into, well, and honestly, across the country, into community emergency response teams, or what we call CERT, CERT teams. And that's those are response teams made up of trained citizens, civil defense basically. They go through all types of training. One of the things we've done to engage our CERT teams here in Nevada is we are doing a AFN, an access and functional needs specific training with the community members to really help them at an operational community level understand how to go out in their neighborhoods after a disaster and make sure they have that social connectedness with their neighbors and individuals with disabilities. And so we have that program going right now in Nevada.
Great. And then I know there's a question. We won't be able to actually get to all the questions today, but you are welcome to contact Heather. You are also welcome to contact the Pacific ADA Center, and that has been in the chat, and I'll show you that slide in just a moment. But one of the last questions is, do you have a suggestion on how to start the process with your state Office of Emergency Management?
If we, so that's a great question. That advocacy, if you are working with your Centers for Independent Living or your governor, every state has their version of the Governor's Office of Developmental Disabilities, really getting your larger advocates to help engage with you when you're reaching out to the Office of Emergency Management. If your state doesn't have an access and functional needs officer, I think that's a great first start.
Okay,
That was
great.
a great question.
Great suggestion. And this is how you would contact with the Pacific ADA Center and how you would follow us on social media. So you are welcome to do that. And we can also get any specific questions over to Heather as well. And I know Heather did address several comments and areas about people who are, well, not just deaf who are using ASL interpreters, but people who are hard of hearing as well.
Mhm.
And so Heather, can you maybe address whether that's, captioning or other kinds of assistive listening devices?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, because that's a great point, Jan, we did in Nevada, is we recently this year for our hard of hearing community deployed communication boxes to our rural and frontier shelters and emergency managers so that they have those, you know, um, the pocket talkers and Dubio UOs and all of the different assistive devices. But we're also working with them on captioning and some of our other accessible features. So that's a great question. Because I know interpreters that's very visible. We see that, but for our hard of hearing community, a lot of the accessible equipment they use is not as noticeable sometimes, and might not get thought of. So we are definitely working on that as well.
Great. And then our last question before we will need to wrap up here is, what are your thoughts on maintaining disability registries for emergency planning? I know that can often be a difficult question.
Yeah, so I find this question not as difficult as some. We are against disability registries at the Office of Emergency Management. We do not help support, build them, or maintain them, mostly because we have found they are ineffective and not used appropriately during disasters. And a lot of times when you join a registry, there's a misinformation about what will happen because a lot of that community now thinks, resources or someone is coming in a disaster now that they've identified themselves, and that's just not the case. And so we found instead of that approach, we really use that seamless framework we talked about to make sure we're integrating every part of the disaster cycle. We're ready and we're prepared, and we've thought this through together. So that hopefully we don't have some of these gaps and we start to buy down real risk. And so hopefully that help answers that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Please do take a moment to complete the evaluation. The link is at the bottom of the chat. And please do contact your ADA National Network Center, whether that's Pacific ADA Center or another center that is in the other part of the country. 1-800-949-4232 is the number where you should be able to reach the center where your area code corresponds to. And we really thank you very much for joining us today. And we thank Heather so much for presenting for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jan. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. And that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you also, interpreters and captioner.